Hello, my name is Israel Wheatley, and today I will be presenting an analysis of how Marc-Antoine Mathieu breaks traditional codes in the world of the bande dessinée in his works Mémoire Morte and S.E.N.S, as well as in his collaboration with other artists for installation pieces with Lucie Lom, all putting into question how bande dessinée can be told through images, but without text. Published in 2000, Marc-Antoine Mathieu's graphic novel Mémoire Morte follows the traditional rule of the bande dessinée, this rule which authors and artists have conformed to for over 150 years. Mathieu, in his work as author, illustrator, and in collaboration with other artists of Lucie Lom, puts these traditions into question. Does the BD need to follow these rules decided generations prior? Can a BD be without text? I will here dive deeper into how Mathieu challenges the supposedly inherent tension between text and image in his two works, S.E.N.S and Mémoire Morte, and how he defines this new era of the bande dessinée, one where text is merely optional. But before we can define the new era of the bande dessinée, it would first be important to define what exactly is meant by text and image. Text in itself is a visual representation of language. As linguist Steven Pinker puts it, language is a uniquely human instinct to communicate meaning using grammatical codes in words, typically vocalizations, representing either concrete objects or abstract ideas. Language has historically broadened its meaning to include other methods of communication, such as body language. Sign language, though not consisting of vocalizations, instead makes use of gestures to create words and meaning. Language does not inherently contain meaning, it is only used to create it. Image, in the case of the bande dessinée, refers to the visual representation of the scene or events shown. As we will see later, the image and the text have a symbiotic relationship, each with its own role in the bande dessinée. Mathieu, in Mémoire Morte, questions this relationship between these two elements with this final panel. Sans langage, y a-t-il une réalité? In other words, can a perceived reality exist without the language to describe it? The so-called inventor of the genre that is the bande dessinée, Rodolphe Töpfer, sets these two elements together as essential codes of the bande dessinée. Les dessins, sans ce texte, n'auraient qu'une signification obscure. Le texte, sans les dessins, ne signifierait rien. In establishing these rules, Töpfer created a precedent for authors and illustrators. And though styles have developed and tradition has expanded to include other characteristics, such as Hervé's ligne claire, there seems to be always a present tension between text and image, the one describing what the other can't show, the other showing what the one can't describe. Sit with this photo. A typical, seemingly essential aspect of contemporary published works, comic books, graphic novels, films even, is the title, which is typically found on the front cover of the book. Even in film, the title is often intercut in the beginning of the film or sometimes at the end. Regardless, it is normal to name a work. But my challenge for you now is to sit with this work by Mathieu. Nowhere in the book is a letter written or drawn, sans un mot, excluding publisher information in the back of the book. In this case, Mathieu has the title virtually disconnected from the work itself. Yet we know. Mathieu's illustrations give enough information for us to fill in the meaning of the title. Sens, direction. Two concepts we can attach to this work because of the expressive imagery. A man looking where an arrow is pointing. That's all we need to know. Similarly, Moebius's multi-volume story alters the spelling of its titles for each of its volumes. In addition to its complete lack of words, using only images, this is a play instead on the multiplicity of text and its relation to spoken language. Letters may be rearranged, added, or removed, but this won't change the pronunciation of the title, Alzac. Now with S.E.N.S, as we turn each page, the meaning continues. Just as we have learned to follow the patterns of a BD, as we have learned to read from left to right, to understand symbolism of meaning, as we know that turning the page is meant to continue the story, we follow this mute man as he follows his sense. This filling in of meaning gives the work its essence, something that words excel at, sometimes with extreme precision, other times with struggle. Even the image alone can be put into question, which we can observe with installations by Lucie Lom, with whom Mathieu collaborates. In this installation, Sylva, the three-dimensional space is transformed into a forest formed by the projection of images onto objects. What we are seeing is really just a manipulated form of a two-dimensional image. Walking through this manufactured forest scene brings a sense of unease and anxiety, translated directly from the image into the atmosphere rather than from a combination of text and image. Will Eisner's installation Cité de la bande dessinée et de l'image takes silence a step further with this immersive interdimensional world where two-dimensional bande dessinée images add depth and story to this three-dimensional setting. Although this scene does utilize language, it only gives it as a charm to give detail to the world. The emphasis here lies with the outline of the body on the ground, bullet holes in the crate in the back, footprints next to a drawing of a gun. We can piece together our own gruesome story by viewing these images, themselves representing specific moments in time rather than describing them with words. With this installation by François Schneider, L'eau dessinée, countless crinkled papers, some blank, some with drawings, create an atmosphere without language, using floating two-dimensional images to create a three-dimensional space. As described on the Lucie Lom website, this installation transforms pages into water, playing with our connection with the environment, travel, imaginary worlds, or with our own bodies and traditions in bathing. But the world of the bande dessinée has historically been far from silent, far from being just imagery or space. Allow me to return to the past to show where exactly Mathieu expresses this idea of novelty and the breaking of tradition in the bande dessinée. Mémoire Morte, published in the year 2000, colloquially known as Y2K, exists in its own unique universe that itself is not devoid of language. To recap, Mémoire Morte tells the story of a city in crisis having to deal with the sudden construction of mysterious walls, the refusal of their all-knowing, supremely artificially intelligent creation, ROM, to help with these problematic walls, itself a reflection of the imaginary crisis which our own world was going through at the turn of the century, as well as the resulting loss of memory and language in the citizens of the story. As the story progresses, dialogue becomes more and more sparse, and these trous de mémoire make for more and more difficulty with reading comprehension. As we read the weakening dialogue, our minds stop at every ellipsis, struggling to follow the sentence in its full flow. We are left with a silent city, but we are never left without the company of the all-knowing Ram, the narrator of the story. We grow accustomed both visually and textually to Ram's omnipresence, to his verbal narration, to his connections with fades to black, to his black text bubbles in stark contrast with the human character's typical dialogue. At first glance, his narration resembles a caption, or une légende. Indeed, they themselves are a sort of monologue recounting the story as he has experienced it through the other characters. Tupfer and Peters have reason to believe that the two key elements of the BD create a flow, a seemingly inescapable push and pull. Ce que le texte vient offrir est précisément ce que l'image ne pourrait donner, et vice-versa. From these images, we are able to draw the sentimental meaning of the sequence. This man is at the center of the story, remaining calm amidst a group of disheveled and desperate people, opposed to him with white coats rather than black. As they seem to be in crisis, he is merely settling down. Yet as Mathieu pulls the image closer to Ouf, he also narrows down the commentary by the others. One of them has said something that stops Ouf in his tracks, and he now has a clue that leads him a step closer to solving this problem. But without text, the rest of the puzzle is unclear. With the text, dialogue, and Ram's narration, we understand more about this story. We understand now that this Ram is involved in one way or another, and that he is generally not quiet. His silence has disturbed the protagonist, a detail that remains absent without the text. So, what Mathieu does here with images, including with their sequencing and arrangement, is give feeling to the text. Rather than describe to us how the characters are feeling or what they're experiencing, he shows us. Moebius does this quite well in Arzac, even going so far as to show us two characters appearing to speak with one another. On the first page, we see a character urinating into a hole in the ground, followed by the arrival of the police. The following page shows the outcome of this interaction, the hole swallowing the police and the two characters hiding from this scene. Instead of relaying what the police says to the other character, we see the outcome of their interaction. This is not the case necessarily with Mémoire Morte. While Mathieu does express character sentiments through imagery, he utilizes text not only to describe the situation, but also to pose questions. Apprenez d'abord à lire le présent, et votre mémoire vous servira à quelque chose. First learn to read the present, and your memory will serve a purpose. In this sequence, Ram does far more than clarify, or not clarify, the story. He gives in more detail who he is, the history of his creation, and more importantly, the problems that we face as humans, our faults. These abstractions can be observed in vague detail in Mathieu's imagery, but ultimately serve to feed us questions and ideas. While we know now more about who or what Ram is, we are intentionally left in the dark. We leave Ram in silence, and the protagonist, he leaves with nothing more than a deeper look into humanity's problems. That is, Ram leaves us with questions. Rather than solving the city's problem for them, he steps back. His contribution to their success is silence, and as Mathieu shows us, with nothingness comes questions. To echo Ram's advice, apprenez d'abord à lire le présent. Mathieu, through Ram, places this story in two separate times, the past and the present. The main portion of the text, everything in between the prologue and the epilogue, remains fixed in the past. Ram tells us from the start that he will recount what happened. Permettez-moi de faire un retour sur ce qui s'est passé. What this essentially does, in harmony with the story's circular structure, is place both the prologue and the epilogue in the present, fixed in a matter of immobile moments. That is what we read. The beginning is the end, and the end is the beginning. What's done is done. His story isn't about returning to the past to regain memory, but rather to see where things have gone wrong, to form questions whose answers lie in the present. Mathieu here, with his visual mirroring and ultimate question, prompts us to return to the beginning, a return to the present. We are struck with familiarity, and the idea is implanted in our head to look again. Have we really seen the same thing twice? Can we read this story without following the text? The story's past is reframed once we see the present, and we are then prompted to understand everything from this new perspective. Yet, more importantly, we aren't exactly left with answers, but rather with a question that forces us to adapt and change what we have learned to what we can know. Rather than rely on the past, we must instead look at the present, look at the changes unfurling in our eyes. In other words, to venture away from the tradition of drawing images with text, or even putting into question our history with bathing. From maintaining a narrative structure built off the previously inextricable tension between text and image. No, this isn't a question about our world, and it never was. This is an infinite world, one where the beginning is the end, a concept that we here on Earth cannot perceive with our own senses. This is a question about their world, the world of the bande dessinée, where stories and worlds are infinite, timeless, never-ending, where Tintin never tires from solving crimes, from traveling across the limitless globe, where Astérix and Obélix exist simultaneously in all their tales, the phantoms of their past tales unchanging in the present world. Their words are formed in boxes and spawn from their two-dimensional bodies. This is a question not about our language or our reality, but instead about the reality of the bande dessinée, a representation of time as it stands still in the moment of its creation. As our time progresses, so does their world, and so must the rules that dictate their existence. They indeed have more to tell us than words can express. The story doesn't conclude, which is an impossible feat. Mathieu leaves us in the dark, and it is both textually and visually unclear whether or not the people have regained their memory or their language. They're in the middle of constructing their new city, hardly finished. They stray from the laws of their old city, now building in circles rather than with rigid, conformist structures. With such an unfinished story, however, we are left with Ram's tendency towards interrogation, and again left alone with our ability to find answers. And with 7 words, with a multitude of imagery and philosophical inquiries, Mathieu leads us on a wild goose chase to find the answer to his question. And, while we may not know where the answer lies, there's only one way to find out. Thank you.